So I welcome you to our last week in the study of Genesis. It's been a fairly long one. It could have been much longer. We've sort of condensed some things down a little bit. There's just a tremendous amount of information in the book. It is the book of beginnings. It's a book you can read over and over, and you'll learn something new every time that you read it. But I thought it'd be appropriate as we end Genesis to focus on the key I hate to say character, but the key person in the closing chapters of Genesis, and that's Joseph, of course. And as you'll remember from the story, of course, his brothers sold him. Well, they were going to take him out. They were going to kill him, actually. They were very jealous of him. And he had this coat of many colors that his father had given him. And they haul him out to kill him, and then in the end decide, no, they'd throw him in a pit. Let the lions do it, and then along came the slave trading caravan, and the brothers decided that, you know what, instead of killing him, we'll sell him off as a slave, and we'll make it look like he got killed with it was goat's blood, I think they spread all over his coat. And of course his father thought that he was dead for years and years. But Joseph, thrown into a situation completely not of his own doing, continues to keep his faith strong in God, and finds himself in any number of situations which each of them seem to kind of backfire on him. He becomes the manager of the household, Potiphar's household, and then gets falsely accused of chasing after Potiphar's wife, and then he gets thrown in prison, and then he correctly interprets the baker's dream, but then the baker forgets to tell somebody, hey, he did that, get him out of the prison. He spends a long time in prison until finally he gets the opportunity at God's perfect timing to interpret the dream about the famine coming upon Egypt. And he's made the second in charge, of course, and 7 years of plenty, and they store up all this grain. And in fact, it's interesting, having been in the Kakar of Jordan over at Tel El Hammam, where we're excavating Sodom, one of the things you see there are these silos that they dug deep into the ground to store grain, all the way back the time of Abraham. So it's fascinating how they knew even back then how to store food. Joseph became a central figure in God's plan as his people were beginning to gather in Egypt. And then, of course, we have 215 years of slavery, and then the Exodus. And, of course, lots of speculation about the date of the Exodus. Myself, I'm one of those that hold to the Exodus probably happened about 1450 or so BC. Still working on that question, actually, as a part of my studies in the doctorate on archaeology. But it appears that the Exodus more than likely was around 1400, 1450 BC, something like that. And of course, then that was the birth of the nation of Israel. All from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and all according to God's plan. So with that, let's have a look for just a brief time this morning as we close this study at Joseph himself. We're going to kind of hop around the Bible a little bit, which may be a little challenging for me. I'm trying to get used to the electronic version of the Bible instead of the paper one. But we're going to start in Genesis 39. So if you either have your Bible or your iPad or whatever you have your Bible on, Genesis 37 will be our first one. Let's look over at Genesis 37 for a minute. And again, we're looking at Joseph. And we read Genesis 37, 5 through 9. And what we're doing, I've listed, I think, it's 8 of them. What are some of the characteristics that Joseph portrayed? How do we know he was a real man of God? And so we're going to look at this first one. It sort of gives us insight into the man Joseph himself. And so 37, 5 through 9, this is when he's still back home now. It says, Then Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, Please listen to this dream which I have had. For behold, we are binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up, and also stood erect, and behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to mine. Then his brothers said to him, Are you actually going to reign over us? Or are you really going to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and his words. Now he had still another dream, and he related this one to his brothers and said, Lo, I've had still another dream, and behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars are bowing down to me. And so he was a dreamer, and the dreams were about ruling and him being a ruler. Genesis 39, now we go over to Genesis 39, gives us some further insight into the man Joseph, and we'll look at verses 1 through 6 first. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar and an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites, who had taken him down there. And the Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw that the Lord was with him, and how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. And I wonder if you've ever been like that, ever had, a job or some responsibility of some kind, and the way you conducted it told people you were a follower of Christ. Have you ever had that experience? I hope so, because that is what will happen. And clearly Joseph was like that, and here's an Egyptian, non-believer for sure, seeing God in the success that Joseph was having, managing his household, his wealth, and so on. So Joseph found favor in his sight and became his personal servant. And he made him overseer of his house, and all that he owned he put in his charge. And it came about that from the time he made him overseer in his house and over all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. Thus the Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned in the house and in the field, so that the master here left everything he owned in Joseph's charge, and with him there he did not concern himself with anything except the food which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. So now we have further description of Joseph. Good-looking guy, intelligent, able to lead, knew how to manage things, money, possessions, run the house, run the farm, whatever it was that he was in charge of there. And all of it with the Lord guiding him. And he was a success at all of it, even in a foreign land, and even after a bad situation where his brothers had sold him into slavery. So then we can jump down to verses 20 through 29 in the same passage. So Joseph's master took him and put him into jail. So this has to do with Potiphar now, believes he's been trying to mess with his wife. Puts him into jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in jail. But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. Even in jail, God's presence in Joseph's life shining through and granting him favor. And the chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in the jail. So now he's in charge again. You see this over and over again where he's in charge of things. He's obviously quite skilled at it. So that wherever was done, he was responsible for it. And the chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made him to prosper. So Joseph knows how to lead. He's used to leading. He's used to succeeding. And yet he continues his walk with God. He realizes it's all coming from God. What a guy. He just remained faithful regardless of the circumstance. So then another thing we can see about him is found over in verse 39:6. I wanted to we read this earlier, but I wanted to reinforce this. So he left everything he owned in Joseph's charge, and with him there he did not concern himself with anything except the food which he ate. And then we're going to tell us that he was good looking. That was another part of it. He never got hung up in his looks. He was not a vain person. He wasn't into designer jeans and all of those kinds of things. Today, society, we have a lot of emphasis on what good looking is, and as a result of that, particularly with young girls, we have anorexia and those kinds of things happening because we get too obsessed with the body. Now the reverse is we don't do anything about it, and then we have the whole obesity situation, but there's a tendency, particularly when you're young, to really focus on your body, and if you're good looking, that can actually be a detriment to you. But not in Joseph's case. He didn't let his looks, his appearance, and his skills give him a big head, if you will. And then I wanted to go back now and read, this is Potiphar's wife, and see what kind of man Joseph is in this situation. Beginning in verse 7, it says that it came about after these events that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph. Well, he's a good-looking guy, he's successful, and so on, and he's not an Egyptian, so pretty attractive probably. And she said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house." The master is trusting me with everything. "And he has put all that he owns in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?" As she spoke to Joseph day after day, he did not listen to her to lie beside her or be with her. And also notice, by the way, all of this is happening years, hundreds of years, before God will give the Ten Commandments to the Jews in the wilderness. He knew, just because of his walk with God, that lying with another man's wife was wrong. He didn't need the Ten Commandments to tell him that. So how can I do this sin against God? And so as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he did not listen to her to lie beside her or be with her. So she was just hounding him constantly. Now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household were there inside. She caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. And when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought in a Hebrew to make sport of us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I screamed. And when he heard that I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled and went outside." So she left his garment beside her until his master came home, and then she spoke to him with these words, "The Hebrew slave whom you brought to us came in to me to make sport of me, and as I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." Of course, this also illustrates a cardinal rule that we all, particularly guys, but all of us, need to. You should not be in a room with a person of the opposite sex if you're by yourself, particularly if you're in Christian counseling, you're a pastor, you're a Sunday school teacher, whatever it is. We always need to be careful. We always need to be above board and present the right appearance and take precautions like that. Now, Joseph was smart to get out of the house immediately. But consequently as well, of course, he had no witnesses to what happened other than it was his word against hers. And, of course, he was the alien in a strange land and the good-looking guy to boot. So he's falsely accused, has no defense, and is immediately thrown into prison. And then we read how God was with him even in prison. And the chief of the prisons put other prisoners under Joseph. Just a remarkable, remarkable story. So then I wanted to go ahead and we'll skip down here to question 7. And we'll go to Genesis 41. We're continuing to look at what kind of man Joseph was. And here we're going to read 14 through 16 and look at what happens here. Now, what's happening here, of course, this is Pharaoh has a dream. In fact, let's read a little bit about that dream for a second. Now, and I'm in verse 1. Now it happened at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he was standing by the Nile. And lo, from the Nile there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed in the marsh grass. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them from the Nile, ugly and gaunt, and they stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. The ugly and the gaunt cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows. Then the Pharaoh awoke, and he fell asleep and dreamed a second time, and behold, 7 ears of grain came upon a single stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 ears, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. The thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. Then Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Now in the morning his spirit was troubled, so he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men, and Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret it. And I just hit the, here we go. There was no one who could interpret it. Then the chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I would make mention today of my own offenses. The Pharaoh was furious with his servants, and put me in the confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard, both me and the chief baker. We had a dream on the same night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. And now a Hebrew youth, was with us there, a servant of the captain of the bodyguard, and he related them to him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. And to each one he interpreted according to his own dream, and just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me in my office, but he hanged him. So now we get the full story. This is the dream the pharaohs had, and then of course the two prisoners had their dreams, but the one poor fellow got killed, executed, and then this guy got his job back, but neither ever mentioned Joseph prior to this. So now they're telling the Pharaoh there's a good dream interpreter. He's down in prison. Well, then Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph, and they hurriedly brought him out of the dungeon. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, but no one can interpret it. And I have heard it said about you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph then answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. And that's what I wanted you to see there. Joseph, along with all of his other attributes, always gave God the credit. He never, ever got caught up in his own success, ever. It was always God doing everything, even though the skills that he had, and the looks that he had, and the jobs that he got, and the success that he had, was always given to God's credit and not of his doing. And this runs counter to the world around us, where successful people believe they're successful because of their hard work and their intelligence and who they know and what they know and all of that. But no, for us who follow Christ, we know that our success comes from him. And Joseph knew that God had done all these things. It wasn't him. He was just using Joseph as a conduit, if you will, in the terms of interpreting dreams. And then the last thing I wanted you to see is how Joseph, we're going to skip ahead to Genesis 50. So Joseph had a wife, an extraordinary one, from, thrown in a pit so the tigers can get you, to sold off as a slave and then falsely accused and living in prison, and now you're the second in charge of Egypt. What a life. But here we're going to read about how Joseph reacts. Well, have a look. We're going to be in Genesis 50, verses 16 through 21. 16 through 21. And so we'll start with 15. So what's happened here is Joseph's father now has passed away, and of course the whole family's down there in Egypt now. And the brothers are concerned that while Dad was alive, Joseph was sort of behaving himself and treating the brothers fine. But they were concerned that once Dad was gone, they were going to get treated harshly for everything they had done to Joseph. But let's look at what actually happens. So Genesis 50, verses 15 through 21. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, What if Joseph bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong which we did to him? So they sent a message to Joseph, saying, Your father charged before he died, saying, Thus you shall say to Joseph, Please forgive, I beg you, the transgression of your brothers and their sin, for they did you wrong. And now, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also came and fell down before him and said, Behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, Do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. So therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. And so he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. And so we see that Joseph, very wise, faithful servant of God, saw that all the things that had happened to him, many were bad, many he didn't understand at the time. But in looking back, he saw that God meant it all for good, even though his brothers meant it for evil. And we have to have that same attitude with our walk with Christ, that many things that for us may seem evil or painful or harmful at the time, God will actually use for good. And so we have to have the same faith that Joseph has, even during those times of struggle. So what a man Joseph was, and what a way to end our study in Genesis. And to close then, we'll read the last few verses in chapter 50. It says, "Now Joseph stayed in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw the third generation of Ephraim's sons, also the sons of Machir, the sons of Manasseh, were born on Joseph's knee. Joseph said to his brothers, 'I am about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which he promised on oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob.' Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, 'God will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones up from here.' So Joseph died at the age of 110 years old, and he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt." And as we'll see when we do our study in Exodus, when Moses leads the nation of Israel out of bondage and out of Egypt, they will carry Joseph's bones with them, and he will be buried in the Promised Land. So I hope you've enjoyed this study. Genesis is a great book. It covers so many things, and it is just the book of beginnings. So I hope you've gotten a lot from it. I've really enjoyed teaching and studying myself, and hope you have as well. So may God bless you as we continue to study His holy word.